Today, we are going to discuss about how the cultural meanings, as Claude Lévi-Strauss discussed. We are going to continue with the same argument. Now, when signifying system, which is actually a very vast concept, and it means any organized structure of set of signs, and those set of signs carry cultural meanings. Now, in this category, or this you can say is a very diverse phenomena, because in this diverse phenomena so many things are included, such as works of literature, because if you're talking of cultural meaning you have to think about all those aspects. Work of literature or tribal ritual. In tribal rituals you will find out, or or in a work of literature you'll find out a ceremony of handing over a degree that he has completed certain things, or in tribal culture you will find out, a tribal rituals you will find out rain dance and all those things used to take place. It has got its own specific cultural meaning. Or even he talked about fashion in clothing, food, lifestyle. There's a typical cultural meaning behind it. Or you can say in styling of cars or in the contents of the advertisements. Everything carries a sort of cultural meaning in itself. Without cultural meaning, nothing is being explained. It carries a cultural meaning. And for any structuralist, the culture in which we are part of it can be read like a language using the principles of language. Since culture is made up of structural networks, and those cultural networks carry significance and it can be shown to operate in systematic way. All those structured network or structural network, they work in a very systematic way. It operates in a very systematic way so that the meaning of that cultural thing appears in front of us. Now, the networks which operates we are talking about, how these networks are operated. Those networks are operated through codes, CODES, through codes. Codes working as a sign, a system of signs. Sign, SIGNS, not science. They can make statements just as you find it in language, and they can be read or decoded by the structuralist or even by semiotician. For example, fashion. Fashion can be read like a language. This is what structuralists used to tell. Separate items or features are added up into a complete outfit or a look. In fashion, which can be read like a language, and we add separate items and features into it to make it complete outfit. We add something into it to make it complete. or we want to give a look with a complex grammatical rules of combination. There are complex grammatical rules of combinations. What is to be with what? How these rules of combinations? We don't wear an evening dress and carpet slippers, or you don't come to the lectures in a military uniform, or you go in a police will not come into his house wears to the duties. There are certain complicated, you can say complex grammatical rules of combinations in wearing the things, because each thing which you in a fashion, if you think about each thing or each component in it derives a meaning from the structural context. It derives a meaning from its structural context, and that's why you will find out in a couple of months back, government of Maharashtra announced that there is going to be a typical dress code for the officers who are coming to the office. Why? Because the dress which you wear, it carries certain structural context into it. There's a meaning out of that structural context. You need not to say, and that's why at the beginning of our research methodology, somewhere in between, I said to you that your non-verbal communication speaks more than your communication. What you wear, because your wearing always give a sort of meaning to it. It is giving a meaning to it. What exactly it means by what do you want to say. Without saying any word, your fashion will able to tell you what you are. Of course, my friends, many fashions in clothing, especially, depend on breaking such rules in knowing way. It used to break the rules in knowing way. A few examples from our routine understanding, routine life. If you ask your parents or grandparents, they will tell you that you are not allowed to wear any cloth which is tear off. So they will stitch it up and then you use to wear. Now what is the change? Knowing it that it is not accepted in the system, it is not allowed in the system. What clothing industry did? Clothing industry brought the tiered jeans. Somewhere it is tear off, which is not accepted in our routine trend of wearing clothes. But now it becomes a fashion. So clothing, fashions in clothing depends on breaking such rules in knowing ways. But the statement made by such rule breakers, that what I said is a very common thing. Tier dresses or making outer garments which look like undergarments or cutting an expensive fabrics in a very rough way. There is no uh, symmetry into it because there are certain prior rules that you have to be very typical in wearing certain dresses. You have to wear such kind of dresses which will not expose your body. That is what a general conventional understanding. But nowadays, now you cannot say that no, this is not accepted. That is now a way of living life. How can you reject it? Okay, if you don't like it, don't wear. You don't wear it. But you cannot force other people not to do that. That is not in your hands. So the change, the rule breakers, the rule breaks made a statement. They always used to create a statement. And how the rule is broken, that depends on the existence of earlier rule or convention, which is conspicuously flouted in the system. It is part of the system. Now, in fashion world, you have to find it out, my friends. Somehow, the way the clothing industry is changing itself, it needs to be deconstructed. And if you take this feature, that how this clothing industry in the name of fashion is simply trying to expose the seams or crumpled looking garment fabrics or garments, sometimes wearing too big or sometimes wearing too small, and the wearer is signifying it as a fashion. It needs to be. It is a deconstruction of the existing prior conventions or norms. Now, if you take any of these features out of context, if you take any of the features out of context, they'll merely signify you that you have your jacket on inside out and don't believe it in ironing. You don't want to iron it. Sometimes it is what you say, this is how I wear. Now again, these individual items have their place in the overall structure. You cannot say no, this is not part of the clothing. No, this is part of clothing, whether you iron it or don't iron it, whether you are wearing an exposed seams or you are wearing a tiered jeans or when you are wearing a zip jeans, whatever, zip clothes or big clothes than your size or small clothes than your size. You cannot say that this is not part of cloth. This is part of overall structure. And the structure, overall structure, is of a greater significance than an individual item. What is a greater structure? Greater structure is to wear a cloth. That is important than an individual item. What he is wearing, it is an individual item. But at least he is wearing clothes. That is how you can say it. That's why structuralism is, when it is talking about, it is not simply talking about the words which are written there. It is talking about each and everything of your life. It is dealing with each and every aspect of human life. Now, if you see the other major figure who talked on, apart from Ferdinand de Saussure, who worked on linguistics and language, other Claude Lévi-Strauss works on anthropology and tried to get a mythical interpretation of it and trying to find out the uh, anthropological aspect into it and searching that how the things are going on in this way that you are finding it in uh, different factors of your living life. You will find out all these things that are going on. These two are the major figures in structuralism. The other major figure in structuralism was Roland Barthes. Rolandbarthes. He is one of the key and prominent figure. Please remember his name, because when we talk about post-structuralism in next part of this unit, Roland Barthes plays a very crucial role into it. Roland Barthes, he's a French person, so that's why I'm pronouncing it as his name is not Ronald, it is Roland Barthes. It is not Barthus, not it is not like that. Roland Barthes, Barthes. Roland Barthes, who applied the structuralist method to the general field of modern culture. Please understand, literature carries culture in itself, and that's why cultural studies is the most important and prominent branch of studies in literature. Roland Barthes studies culture. He's a very key critic and theorist in structuralism, post-structuralism, and cultural studies. Now, Roland Barthes examined modern France. That is the 1950s, I'm telling. From a standpoint of a cultural anthropologist. As a cultural anthropologist, he observed the French society. And he wrote a little book in 1957 called Mythologies. Now, this looked at a host of items. He mentioned certain host of items which had never been subject before. This has not been studied as a subject before. Roland Barthes mentioned it in his book. And he gave a very intellectual analysis to it in that book. Such as, to take an example from his book, he gave, we are not discussing his whole book, Mythology. We are talking about a few things of mythologies that he discussed. He talked in that book the difference between boxing and wrestling. That's why this book is very interesting one, because he's talking about those subjects which are not even treated as subject. He's talking about boxing and wrestling. The significance of eating stick and chips, or the styling of Citroen car. The Citroen car, which is now coming to India, the new car. You will see advertisements right now going on every television channel, Citroen car. Or the cinema image of Greta Garbo's face. Greta Garbo is one of the very famous Hollywood actress. These are the subjects of Roland Barthes, who wrote all those things on these subjects. And that's why I said literature, you cannot restrict literature to only poem, drama, novel, fiction. Not at all. You can have so many areas open to you. And structuralism is trying to bring out all these areas in front of us. So he dealt with such subjects which are never treated as subjects. The cinema image of Greta Garbo's face, or a magazine photograph of Algerian soldier who is saluting French flag. If you see these examples that Roland Barthes is trying to discuss as a study of culture, and from cultural anthropology, perspective of cultural anthropology, from the viewpoint of cultural anthropology, he's studying all these subjects. Each of these items, whatever items, for example, we have taken 3-4 items out of it. Each of these items, if you see very clearly, my friends, he placed all these items within a wider structure of values, beliefs, and symbols. Wider structure of belief, values, and symbols as the key to understand everything. Please understand, we even, our routine life run on these typical 3 words. If you carefully see this, if you carefully observe this: value, beliefs, and symbols. If you see very carefully, what Roland Barthes says, boxing is seen as a sport concerned with repression and endurance. Boxing is a sport which talks about repression and endurance. It is distinct from wrestling, because wrestling, in boxing, pain is flamboyantly displayed. The pain is constantly shown to you. When somebody, the boxer hits the punch, the pain you can able to see when it is hit. The pain is always displayed with a magnificent, on a large scale. You can able to understand that pain. For a moment, imagine if somebody hits you with his hand, a punch with a boxing gloves. What will happen with us? We'll cry because of the pain. We'll shout because of that hit. We scream loudly because of that hit. But you find boxers do not cry in the ring. When they are sitting out, getting away from that field within an interval, within for a break, then they never used to cry. Boxer do not cry out in pain when he hit. When he hit very forcefully, boxer never cry. Now the rules cannot be disregarded at any point during that bout, during that pain. He cannot say that what is the general value, that if there is a pain, don't do that. But he is not bringing all those general values to it. He is trying, he is not even trying to show that he is not interested in that. He is fighting with enthusiasm. He fights with enthusiasm. He fights as himself. He is not trying to show anyone who is a villain or who is hero. If you're talking in a literary sense, you will say the one who wins is a hero and the one who loses is villain. Do you say so? No, there is no make believe of hero and villain in this fight, in this boxing. By contrast, if you see wrestling, wrestlers grunt, wrestlers, you can say, snarl with aggression. They move fast with an aggression to catch the opponent. You will find out the whole stage, or the ring, which you call in sports terminology. The ring display of agony and triumph, and fight as exaggerated, larger than life villains or superheroes. You will find out if you carefully see these two sports. These two sports are having some different functions within society. Boxing enacts social endurance. Social endurance is sometimes most necessary in your life. And wrestling dramatizes the ultimate struggle, conflict, conflict between good and evil. Roland Barthes' approach here, you will find out, my friends, is that it is a it is a way that a classical structuralist used to talk about understanding the whole structure of it. Now, you may have a little bit of query in your mind that how it is related with. Roland Barthes is talking about that individual item is structuralized or contextualized by structure, and in the process of doing, these layers of significance are revealed to us. He's talking on a broader structure. He's trying to bring all those things in this fashion in front of all of us. So you'll find out Roland Barthes is trying to bring structuralism in culture and finding out the cultural meanings of it. So these are the examples, my friend, for you to understand that if you are trying to use structuralism as one of the mode of your theoretical explanation for the research topic you will select, you can you can apply it in this form, in this way. Even Roland Barthes, in the early period, he examines certain aspects of literature, and by 1970s, when structuralism was attracting widespread attention across the world, various English and American scholars, they are trying to reach to France to understand what exactly structuralism is trying to talk about. Because structuralism, which was basically developed in France, translated in 70s and published in English, so many of English speakers or English knowing societies, they interpret structuralism for their English readers, and in which you will find out a very prominent name appears is of Jonathan Kuhler, Culler, Jonathan Kuhler, who wrote a book called Structuralist Poetics, published in 1975, and another English critic, Terence Hawkes, Hawkes, Terence Hawkes, whose book Structuralism and Semiotics, published in 1977. These books explained structuralism to most of the English readers. And you will find out various scholars, they try to make structuralism known to everyone. Roland Barthes organized various seminars for graduate students so that they can able to know that how structuralism is working. Or David Lodge, a professor of English at Birmingham, who tried to combine the ideas of structuralism with more traditional approach in his book Working with Structuralism, published in 1980. All these people, if you want to work on structuralism, you need to understand structuralism through these books which I mentioned. What structuralists do, if you want to mm, encapsulate and make it in points, that 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, what this structuralists do? Structuralists analyze mainly prose narratives relating to the text, relating the text to some larger containing structure. Here you can also locate your research topic. What structuralists do? They analyze prose narrative. How they are analyzing? They are analyzing the prose narrative, relating it with some larger content structure. What are the larger containing structure? For example, the conventions of particular literary genre. What are the different conventions of that particular literary genre? Or how the network of intertextual connections are there, or a projected model of underlying universal narrative structure, how universal narrative structure is projected into this writing, or they even talk about a notion of narrative as complex of recurrent patterns of motifs, or how the recurrent patterns are coming into these writings. They are trying to analyze all those things by the way of structuralism. The second thing, the structuralist critiques interpret literature in terms of the range of underlying parallels within the structure of language. What are the parallels structure of languages that this writer has used in his text? And taking support of modern linguistics. For example, the notion of my theme. If you don't know my theme, let me tell you what exactly my theme is. My theme is very interesting aspect, my friends. That if you're talking about uh, various anthropological terms, and yesterday we talked about Claude Lévi-Strauss analyzing Oedipus myth. Claude Lévi-Strauss calls the smallest unit in mythologies as mythemes, as we talk about phonemes. Smaller units in a myth, he calls it as mytheme. And these mythemes are always organized in a binary opposition. That's how Claude Lévi-Strauss studied or analyzes these things in this fashion. So they're trying to understand the notion of my theme in the text, or they apply the concept of systematic patterning. Patterns are systematically appearing into the text and structuring the whole field of Western culture or across the cultures, treating as systems of science. There is no limit of subject, right? From ancient Greeks to OTT platforms, you can take anything into it. Anything can be part of it. To understand the pattern, the concept of patterns that are appearing there in the field of Western culture, or you can say in Indian culture or culture across the world, structuralist critics analyzes these things all together. We'll take an example of structuralist criticism. I'll base the examples of methods of literary analysis, which was described and demonstrated in Roland Barthes' book S oblique Z, which is published in 1970. S oblique Z. Now, in this book, the book is somehow of 200 pages, and it is about Balzac, one of the writer, Balzac. Balzac's 30-page story titled the title of the story is Sarah Zen. It is the title of the story is Sarah Zen. And if you see very carefully how he is talking about that story, which he is interested in discussing, because when he's talking about all those things, he is trying to bring out very interesting pronunciation. When you're talking about Sarazen, the spelling is Sarrasine. You will pronounce it as Sarasin Somebody pronounced sir instead of z, but the actual pronunciation is Sarazen. Sarazen. Now, Roland Barthes' method of analysis is divided into 561 units of meaning. 561 units of meaning, which he then classifies into 5 codes. Those 5 codes are with the basic understanding or basic underlying structures of all narratives. Basic underlying structures of all narratives. You'll find out when Roland Barthes is talking about all those things, Roland Barthes took, or he tried to bring out the idea with almost with binary opposition, and he's trying to bring all those codes, which 561 units in 5 codes. He's trying to come with an opening statement about structuralism. If you understand, if you remember the opening statement of structuralism that we discussed, what was the opening statement of structuralism? That it aims to understand the individual item by placing it in the context of larger structure to which it belongs. This is what we talked at the beginning of structuralism. We have to understand with a smaller unit, individual item, ATOM, atom of a larger unit. You are searching the smaller minimal unit, phoneme. My theme, what we talk today. Now, the individual item here is this particular story, Sarazin. Sarazen, that story he discussed in his book called S oblique Z. Now, if you see, Barth is generating all the possible actual narratives as the just as the grammatical structures of the language can be seen, generally generating all the possible sentence which can be produced in a written format or spoken form. Because you find it very carefully, my friend, when you generate a possible statement which you write, you think, or unknowingly the process takes place in your mind with the pattern that you studied of that language earlier. Now, because Roland Barthes is very much related with the post-structural process also, so somehow you will find out S oblique Z, his very famous book, he is trying to bring that example of structuralism, and this text S oblique Z is a primarily structuralist text, but from 1970 onwards, you will find out Roland Barthes has shifted to post-structuralist phase, and in 1968, his very famous article published, The Death of the Author, in which he moved towards post-structuralist understanding. That's why S oblique Z sometimes is not to be considered, is not considered in by most of the scholars that it is somehow a debatable book which can be considered in structuralism or post-structuralism, but basically this is a book based on, basically this is a structuralist text, and this try to find out and try to discuss the precedent and established custom. That's why it has to be considered as one of the best books on structuralism. This is the first reason that why this book is considered to be the best book in structuralism. The second reason is that S oblique Z clearly mentions or contains many elements which subvert the confident positivism of structuralism. It is nevertheless essentially structuralist in its attempt to reduce the immense complexity and diversity possible in fiction. And he tries to bring all this diversity and complexity into five codes. When we talk about, if you know or if you read something of formalist theory in formalism, you will find out a very famous Russian formalist, Vladimir Prop. Vladimir Prop had studied Russian folk tales, and those Russian folk tales he divided that all the Russian folk tales can be summarized in 31 points. And he mentioned all those 31 points in that particular his text. And if you see very carefully Vladimir Prop's article, you will find out in those 31 texts, 31 points, Vladimir Prop is talking about very interestingly of very uh, important 31 points. I'll not read all the 31 points, but I'll read uh, sequence functions that any folk tales carry, because it is not, although he talked about Russian folk tales, but it is applied to all the folk tales across the world. Vladimir Prop mentioned 31 functions of Russian folk tales, and I'll read out from 25th function. What is the 25th function? Is a the function is 25th function is a difficult task is proposed to the hero. 26th, the task is resolved. 27th, the hero is recognized. 28th, the false hero or villain is exposed. 29, the false hero is given a new appearance. 30, the villain is punished. 31, the hero is married and ascends the throne. These are the few of the functions that Vladimir Prop talked about Russian formalism, or functions of Russian folktales, which can be applied to all the folktales if you want. Similarly, you will find out in S oblique Z, Roland Barthes converts the whole complex and difficult structure or diverse structure in fiction into five codes. And all those five codes, you can use it in any, you can apply it to any of the fiction that he's talking about. Somehow, most of the critics used to say that these five codes which Roland Barthes speaks about, that Roland Barthes is sitting on the fence of structuralism and post-structuralism. And that's why those 561 lexis or 561 units of meaning and five codes, they are related to the high structuralism of Roland Barthes. Roland Barthes in his another essay written in 1968, Analyzing Narrative Structures, he pointed out 93 interspersed digressions in any story, in any narration. And is commenting on the digression in narration with a freewheeling comments on narrative. That text is considered to be the post-structuralist text, and in 1973 he wrote a book called The Pleasure of the Text, where he talked about the narrative structures. So Roland Barthes, as I said, divided that text into 561 units of meaning and five codes. I'll talk about those five codes. The five codes identified by Barth in his S oblique Z. The first code, proarietic code. The proarietic code, Proarietic, proarietic code. What is this code? This code provides indications of actions, indications of actions. For example, they began again, or the ship is sailing at a midnight. All the actions that has been taking part into it. He said that these are the proarietic code. The second code he talked about the hermeneutic code. Hermeneutic, Hermeneutic, hermeneutic code, Hermeneutic, hermeneutic code. This code poses questions or enigmas which provide narrative suspense. This code poses questions which provide narrative suspense. For example, you can take that this sentence in any fiction. He knocked on a certain door in the neighborhood. Now the reader is having a question: when he knocked the door of neighborhood, who is living in this neighborhood? Or what kind of neighborhood it was? Such type of questions the reader can have when reading the text. So he called as hermeneutic code. Then the third one is the cultural code. This code contains references out beyond the text to what is regarded as common knowledge. This code, the cultural code, contains references beyond the text to what is regarded as common knowledge. For example, you can take the sentence: Agent Angeles was kind of man who sometimes arrives at work in odd pair of socks. Now this evokes a pre-existing image in the minds of a reader that what kind of man he is, because there's a typical idea of agents wearing the dress and all those things. James Bond, if you have some agent in your mind, you have a pre-existing notion of that particular agent, but this agent is breaking all those nations. A stereotype of bungling incompetence, or perhaps you can find out the image which is simply breaking the image of agents that are in our mind. So the text always used to try to break the common knowledge. It is going beyond your common knowledge. That is called as a cultural code, according to Roland Barthes. The third is semic code, SEMIC. The fourth is semic code. Now, this is also sometimes called as a connotative code. Connotative code is linked to theme, and this code, when organized around a particular proper name, which constitutes a character, when it is organized with a proper name of a character, its operation is demonstrated. Its operations are demonstrated. So it is connotative, it is pointing out towards something, it is reaching out to something. A police inspector appearing in this novel as a character Now, when you say it is a police inspector, you will find out a typical connotative code to it, that he is wearing his dress and he is going to solve the problem or crime. Is it going to resolve the crime? This is a connotative code. The operation of its how it the whole character demonstrate the whole process of his working. This is what he called as a semicode or connotative code. Fifth code is the symbolic code. Now, this code, symbolic code, is also linked to theme, the earlier code. It can link to the earlier code also. But on a larger scale, so to speak, we can point it out that it consists of contrast and pairings. Contrast and pairings related to the most basic binary polarities. It is related with, it consists of contrast pairing related to the most basic binary polarities. Binary polarities, opposite things coming together, male, female, subject, object, sender, receiver, helper, opponent. You'll find out all these binary oppositions, binary objects, binary polarities, night and day, good and evil, life and art, so on and so forth. You can add it. These are the structures of contrasted elements. Contrasted elements are coming together. Contrasted elements, with the help of contrasted elements, you can able to understand that structure. As I said you in the beginning of structuralism, that if you want to prove it is black, you need to have white behind it. Contrast, so that you can able to understand it. And this is the fundamental to human way of perceiving and organizing reality. This is a very fundamental thing of human mind. If you want to understand certain things, you are taking support of the contrast. Then and then it is possible for you to understand. This is called as symbolic code by Roland Barthes in his S/Z. Now, if you see the last two codes, the semicode or connotative code and the symbolic code, these code have generated somehow greatest difficulties, especially in distinguishing one from another. I'll use each in turn as the basis of an example. If you take firstly the symbolic code, which I illustrate in use as the organizing principle for interpretation. If you want to interpret any story or any tale, this fifth code, symbolic code, illustrate us all the organizing principles. A story, the oval portrait, a story by very famous American writer Edgar Allan Poe. If you see this story, you'll find out Edgar Allan Poe was an author who has received considerable attention from both the structuralist and post-structuralists. Because in terms of what structuralists do, what we talked about the list, what structuralists used to do, you'll find out we talked about the category that they are treating narrative as the structure of, as a complex recurrent pattern and motifs. We talked about that. Now in discussing it, I'll enlist your help as a co-writer of this structuralist critique. Now if you make a brief working summary of the plot, which is useful for us. What happened that during a civil war in some unnamed European country in this story, a wounded officer takes a refuge in a recently abandoned chateau, and the room he sleeps in contains an extremely lifelike portrait of a young woman, and there is something written account of this portrait, which this wounded officer finds in the room, and this writing tells us how the artist was her husband, who had become so carried away with the creation of portrait, and he failed to notice that life was kindled in the painting, and it simultaneously drained away from the seater. It is taking away from them. And at the end of the story, placing of the final touch of color, which renders the portrait perfect, coincides with the death of the sitter. Sitter is a model who sits in front of that painter. This, in short, this is the story that Edgar Allan Poe wrote. The most basic difference between any liberal humanist and structuralists reading, the story is read by liberal humanist and the story is read by structuralist. The structuralist comment on structure, the structuralist will comment on symbol, design, which are the main focus of the commentary. While the emphasis on any wider moral significance you will find out, my friends. And indeed, on interpretation in a very broad sense is very much reduced. So instead of going straight to the content in the liberal humanist matter, the structuralist will present first the series of parallels. The structuralist will present echoes, reflections, patterns, contrast, so that the whole narrative becomes highly schematized, is translated in fact into what we call it as a verbal diagram. The structuralist may convert all those things into this, and the structuralist critique to try to find out all those things into it. What a structuralist critique will see, on one hand, he'll see parallels, echoes, reflections, contrast, patterns. Whereas you will find out the liberal humanist will look for plot, structure, character, situation, language, or imagery, you can say. A common liberal humanist, a routine criticism of the text will follow these things: plot, structure, character, motif, or situation or circumstances, language or imagery, he will find it out. Whereas on the other hand, the structuralist will look at parallels, echoes, reflections, contrast, patterns. Now, if you see that every story, everything is having binaries, opposition structures with itself. And if you see the whole narrative that Edgar Allan Poe has made, you will find out all those things. Any story you want to study, any story you want to analyze on the basis of structuralism, you can able to find out these five things altogether: parallels, echoes, reflections or repetitions, contrast, and patterns. So in this way, you can able to make a structural analysis of any particular texts. We'll continue this discussion in tomorrow's lecture also, and we'll find out how this uh, listing of some parallels in Edgar Allan Poe's story, how it works on. We'll talk about all those things tomorrow very carefully. Tomorrow at 10:30, we are going to have the lecture once again.